Welcome to the very first episode of The Galley. Today we have with us Cecil Miller, a first time author, so it'll be his first time and my first time, talking about a topic I'm really passionate about aviation. His book is called Aviation and Traffic Control, and he's got a lot of wisdom to offer us today, so I'm really excited. So, Cecil, give us a background of sort of who you are and how you got to this point as a person.
I tell you, I feel very, very fortunate in that I graduated from high school at the age of 17, and I couldn't afford to go to college. And like everybody else at that age, what are you going to do? And so I decided to, because I didn't turn 18 until December after I graduated, I decided to join the Air Force, let them teach me a trade, one that I could carry out the service and use in public life. And so after basic training, went to career counseling. And in fact, they said with my scores, I could do anything but be a pilot. And what would you like to do? And I said, well, I don't really have a clue. So we talked, and then it was mentioned about going into air traffic control. And more we talked, the more interested I became. And so I started after tech school in Keesler, Mississippi. I was sent to Edwards Air Force Base in California, which is about 90 miles north of LA. It's a test base. And this was 1955 when I joined the Air Force. People wouldn't remember maybe, and I'm not sure history has done service to that period of time, but that was the jet age. That's what they referred to it, and that's where we were going from props to jets. And we'd had World War II. It was over in 1945. The first man to broke sound barrier was 47. The Korean War in 1950 to 53. So there's just all of that kept happening, and then I come along and 2 years later in 55. And it was just really exciting working the X-aircraft. The X-aircraft were mostly rocket airplanes, and the X-1 was a rocket airplane. And I worked the first X-2 to go above 100,000 feet.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, and as Captain Kentrelo, and they named a base in Michigan after him, and Kentrelo Air Force Base. And then on the down closing of military bases, they closed it. But they awarded him the Outer Space Award because they didn't know where outer space was back then. And they thought he went 126,200 feet, and they thought that was outer space. And I worked him 2 years later in an F-104 on a routine flight, and he departed, flying away from the Rogers Dry Lake bed, and his engine flamed out, and he was killed. So I got a special memory for him. And 2 weeks after his X-2 flight, Captain App took the same airplane and went to Mach 3. That's 3 times the speed of sound. And that's the first man that had done that.
Wow, you've seen some really world changing stuff. What made you want to write it down?
When I wrote my book, there was a lot of questions in my mind. And I really was doing research and so forth out of curiosity as much as anything. And I wasn't planning on, putting out in my book. But after I got into it, I thought, I need to share this with others.
Right.
And so naturally, I wanted to know about the beginning of aviation. And I'm sure a lot of people are not aware, you hear the Wright brothers.
Wait, so give us a background. What the audience might not know about the nativity of flight.
Back then, there was a lot of problems over in Europe, and the United States had the attitude we're not going to get involved in any wars overseas. We want to just worry about ourselves. So when the airplane was starting to be built, and like maybe on an assembly line and so forth, the United States didn't have a lot of interest in buying very many, if any, of the Wright planes. The Italians and the Frenchmen did, and a lot of people also, I think, I thought World War I was 1914 to 1918. Well, it was, but we didn't enter the war until 1917. So we stayed out of it, and we stayed out of it, and then we went into the war the final year, 1917 ended. But what do you do with all and they did come along and buy airplanes eventually, and what do you do with all the airplanes? What do you do with all the servicemen? Well, they decided that we did have airmail service, that they used the military to do the airmail. And back then, because of the mountains, you couldn't go coast to coast. So they would take the mail by air to the mountains, and they'd put it on trains, and the trains would take them. But it would save a lot of time for the coast-to-coast mail. And I'm just interested in the first, the first airliner, the first stewardess.
What about the advent of jets beyond World War II? Does your book go over any of those events?
They had the P-59 actually came out before World War II, was the first jet. And the problem with it, what do you do with the jet engine when you build an airplane? They thought, okay, well, here's where the propellers went. We'll just put them on the wing where the propellers went. And it didn't work out too good. And so they used the P-59 mostly as trainers and things like that. And the first real good jet airplane was the F-80 built by Lockheed. And it wasn't ready for World War II. And at the beginning of the Korean War, the F-80 and the P-51. The P-51 was a well-known World War II fighter airplane with propeller, but they was the top fighters. And the F-80 had a straight, wing. It was like 90 degrees from the fuselage. And so when North American was building the F-86, they was doing the same thing. And they had a Russian captive, and he told them that they came up with swept-back wings. And so suggested to North American that they do that. And they said, well, no, they really didn't want to do that. And then they found that the aircraft didn't really do much more than the F-80. And so therefore, maybe they wouldn't buy it after they built it. So they decided to try the swept-back. And so George Welsh went over to Korea, and he taught the pilots. In fact, he shot down a few of the enemy airplanes, but he wasn't supposed to, and he didn't get credit for it. He gave it to the students, and it's a funny ratio. They shot down 700 enemy airplanes to every 100 F-86 that was lost.
Wow.
700 to 100, that's really something. So obviously that was the big fighter. It just flew rings around all the other aircraft.
Well, so what about test pilots? I know that they're super important to you from, the context of your book, and I know that they feature quite often in your book. Are there any stories from test pilots that you care to share right now?
Captain App was a hero. He went to a test pilot school, which is also located at Edwards and still is. And a couple months after he graduated, he was on a mission as a chase pilot. And he had an F-94, and for whatever reason, they wanted to pop a drag chute at 60,000 feet.
Wow. And
they popped this drag chute, and it got caught into the aircraft, and the pilot lost control of the F-94. And he was in a chase airplane, and he followed him down. They landed on the lake bed, and he pulled up, as close as he could. and they got out of his airplane and went over, and the pilot was trapped in the cockpit and he couldn't get out. And there was smoke and flames. And he approached it from one side, but the wind was coming from the other direction and he couldn't get close to it. So he had to go around on the other side. And he tried to get the canopy open, and he had a little bottle there, but he couldn't get it open. And there was a guy pulled up in a Jeep, and he pulled out a gas, well, it was actually a gas can, but fortunately there was no gas in it. It was used for water. And Captain Knapp used that and broke the canopy in and pulled the pilot out. And the pilot had both legs burned off. But anyway, he did live. And so they awarded Captain Knapp the Heroes Award and so forth. And he was well respected and did a good job in the experimental field. And then he chose to take the X-2 up. And he was briefed on the controls and so forth. But when he got above Mach 3, he was going so fast that he felt like he was leaving the controlled area that they had marked off for him. And he didn't want to leave that controlled area, and he made kind of a tight turn back. And when he made that turn, he lost control of the aircraft.
Were you personally involved?
I work Captain Kenslow. By working him, that means I was working local control. I was working the traffic in the air. And then you have a ground controller who would be working somebody on the ground. And also we had a tunable radio that we could tune different frequencies and so forth. And we pretty well knew what the different companies had different test frequencies. And so we tuned in the frequency that the Captain Knapp was on. And we knew that he was in trouble. And we also knew that this was something brand new. As far as I know, it's the only airplane to have it where you could eject the canopy. And you could eject the canopy away from the fuselage, and then you could drive that down to 15,000 feet and then punch out just like you would a jet. And he was able to separate the canopy, and we couldn't communicate with him, and lost communications. And I had the binoculars, and I was looking all over, trying to see something, and I finally seen some smoke. And there was fire trucks standing by on the lake bed, but that was where they thought he was going to land. And of course, he didn't make it, and didn't even make the lake bed. But I spotted the smoke, and I told them where the smoke was, and they went over but when I seen the smoke, is that the fuselage? Is that the canopy, or what's the smoke coming from? And so you don't really know until they get there and check it out. And it turned out he was still in the nose cone and then didn't get out. So those are just sad stories. But I felt it was really interesting. The front of my book, and I would encourage anybody, because I think a lot of that is not taught in history, and I think it's lost. I have so much respect for the pilots of today. In fact, my stepson was an American airline captain, was killed in a private airplane crash. So, we still suffer that, and so the pilots of today have too. But back in the 50s. We lost 26 test pilots. Wow. And of course, how many test pilots do you hear losing today?
Yeah.
With the computers and mock flight and so forth, they have a lot of things worked out before they actually, get in the air. But the time that I was at Edwards was. I think that 4 years it's the biggest 4 years in history that I'm aware of. What happened during those 4 years? I was there in the spring of 1956, and they had a mid-air collision over the Grand Canyon of two airliners first time that more than 100 people were killed in one accident,
Wow.
and that really changed. Back then, the communication of the pilot and the controller were very lacking. The range was not there. You had to relay instructions to each other through the airliner's dispatcher. And so they said, we're going to put more centers across the country, which they did. They put 26 centers, and they put transceivers, transmitters, receivers all across the country, so that the controllers would always be in communication with the airliners or any airplane as far as that goes. So,
if I may interject a little bit.
sure.
Yeah, so I remember a couple of years ago, actually, I was interviewing for a job at an FAA position, and I remember seeing, they gave me a tour of like their labs and things like that, and they showed all the sort of old analog sort of sweeper equipment showing where the statuses of all the aircraft, where all the aircraft were in relation to the tower and all that kind of stuff. And at the time they were modernizing it, I think it was like only a year ago. Yeah, is that sort of the things that you're talking about?
Was that at Atlantic City?
Yes.
Yeah, that's when I got a discharge from the Air Force, and I applied to the FAA. And my hometown is Fairland, Indiana, which is just southeast of Indianapolis. And I put in for, my first request was to go to work at Indianapolis Tower, and I was accepted. And when I got there, remember about the radar? There's only going to put in centers in the major terminals, but Indianapolis had a radar. And why they had a radar? The tech center was located in Indianapolis, and after a few years, they moved it to Atlantic City, which it still sits today. And, it started out with what they call ASR-1, Airport Surveillance Radar, and then they had the SR-2, SR-3, up to SR-11, and I don't know what they got now. But you mentioned where you see everything is it brought to mind two different cases. One was in 1981, the air traffic controllers went on a PATCO strike. Well, when they went on a strike, which facilities were affected and by what percentage? I was at Dallas Fort Worth at DFW. And I don't remember the exact, but I would say we may have been affected 20%. Most of the guys all, came to work. And some facilities were 100% affected. Nobody showed up for work. Wow. So when you're dealing with that, what do you do? Well, it just so happened I went to headquarters for 8 months and returned to Dallas. But when I went to headquarters, I was working in an area where one of the specialists was on detail working on a contingency plan for the what if the controllers do go on strike. So the way they explained it, it's like you have your desk and you put a screw in it. You can take that screw and put it all the way down, which means shut off all the airplanes, or you can let it up a little bit and you control it. And that's exactly what they did. They put all the airplanes on the ground, and we had them all on the ground in an hour and a half. Now, think back at 9/11. 9/11, there was 3 aircraft that was down, 2 of them in Washington, D.C., and the other one in Pennsylvania. And how many more were out there? Was there one that had been hijacked on his way to L.A. and wouldn't get there for a few hours? Is there one going somewhere else? So if we're dealing with all those unknowns, then we put all the airplanes on the ground. And the pilots didn't like it or whatever, but we put them on the ground to the closest airport. And once again, we put them down in a hurry. Now, they had a radar, And on this radar, you could program and say, for example, I want to see all the air carriers, or you could say, I want to see all the American flights, or all the Delta flights, or you want to see all the fighters, the jets for the military, and or I want to see all the Boeing 727s, the type of aircraft. So
Right.
it's a pretty neat tool, and that might be the one that you're looking at. However, it's really, I'm sure, been improved from the day I read.
It was very cool for sure. I never thought about how air traffic control would have to respond to 9/11.
That's one of the things about air traffic control was, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to write a book. It was to explain to the passenger the duties of the controller. The controller is one that nobody sees. You don't hear from them. They're just there, or maybe you don't even think. But you get on an airplane. Normally, the stewardess and the pilot would be at the gate there at the door and welcome you aboard. And when you get up to altitude, the captain will come on the PA system and he'll say, "This is Captain so and so. We're cruising at 35,000 feet. And depending on the weather, bumpy or whatever, keep your seatbelts fastened or feel free to move around." And so you have some interface with the captain. But it's about like if you got on an airplane, in Newark and let's say a car, and it went to Atlantic City and then took that car, a taxi cab driver out to the tech center. Well, you just tell the driver where you want to go and you go, and it's about the same way with an airplane, but it doesn't work that way. We work very closely with the pilot. So I take the reader inside a control room and share them the responsibilities and duties of the pilot and the controller. And also, I was in the business for 58 years. I had 4 years there at the military, and I controlled traffic for 30 years with the FAA. And then I retired and I worked for Lockheed Martin contract supporting air traffic requirements for another 24 years. And that's another thing. It's very unusual for somebody at 17 to wind up with just one career field for 58 years. And I enjoyed doing what I was doing, and I didn't retire until I was 75.
Yeah. So I assume we can read about all these things in the book, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And some.
Yeah.
I assume we can read about all these things in the book.
It's on Amazon, and there's a trailer. And if you watch the trailer, and then if you would hit the pause, it will take you right into Amazon and give you all the information that you need to to purchase it. But I believe there's a story there that, like I said, I wanted to share with everybody. And right now there is a little interest in Hollywood on maybe making a movie. So we'll see how that goes. It's been a nice ride.
Great. That's awesome.
And I understand that you're involved in a publishing company as well.
Yes, being a controller, I'm not a writer by trade. So the way I started with my book was my wife of 58 years is aware of. Yeah, thank you. She's aware of some of the incidents and so forth. Like we had a Delta 1011 crash at Dallas Fort Worth, and so you see a lot of the good and you see a lot of the bad. Yeah, you see a lot. But anyway, my wife wanted me to write some of this down and just for my family. And so then, I started writing things down, but I thought, what would be the odds of my family if I put them in an envelope, ever getting it out and looking at it, And I thought, more I got into it and doing some research, mainly for my own purpose initially. And I thought, if I get a story to tell my family, the best way to tell it would be to write a book, and then they can read it in a book and not in an envelope. So that got me started, and be quite honest with you, very disappointed in my experience so far in the publishing world. They I just didn't. I was made to give it a lot of promises, and the promises weren't kept. And I started doing research in 2014, and my book was first published in 2016. And I changed publishers, so that delays everything. But so I've been around the industry for a little bit, and I've heard a lot of stories and seen a lot of things. And what I want to do, and working with the people that I teamed up with, is help some people don't get trapped into things that we got trapped in.
Right.
We know the ins and outs and what's good, because really my attitude is this: it's not about me, and it's not about it's about the book. And as the book goes, the publisher and the author will go. But when you just try to take the monies away from the author, and then there is no winner, and it's going to catch up with a company like that, and then the author loses out, and the people lose out because they don't get to read a book. So we want to try to overcome that and try to put our best efforts and help the people out the best we can.
What's the name of your publishing company?
Rebirth Book Sellers. Well, that's a good question, because I was amazed how many books are generated every day. And I did some early research a few years back, so it's what do you do with a book? Okay, the recommendation is do not send your manuscript to a traditional book publisher. Traditional book publishers, your big companies. Then you have your smaller publishers that it's more the expense of the author. But if you get in with a traditional book publisher and they buy into your book, they'll give you a contract and they pick up most of the expense. If you send a book to them, a manuscript to them, normally they'll throw that manuscript in the trash or just send it back to you, because they just don't have time to go through all of those books. They're hit heavily. So they have people that look the books over and make recommendations to them. And most of the companies are that way. Like, for example, if you want to get into books in Barnes and Noble, well, those have to be recommended. You just don't, it's
Right.
just not there for anybody. So you learn the ins and outs, and you know the right way to handle. And the main thing is you have to get your book known and get it marketed and marketed properly, because in some cases, they overdo it, and once again, all they want is that money, and then they don't follow up with us. So you've got to really be careful there. But the other two guys in the company with me have been around for a long time, and I have my book is in not only English, it's in Spanish and it's in Chinese.
That's
And
great.
yeah. So well, the thing is, it's international. It's an international book because aviation, English is the international language. When you go into airports, your pilots, your controllers speak English. And it's amazing. I have not done a lot of international promoting of my book. And just today or yesterday, I got an email from a Russian, and was interested in my book. And maybe a year ago, I had two Russian pilots that sent me a message, and I've
Wow.
had responses from Austria, Germany, England. Uh, and the one that I really treasure probably more than any, I got one from somebody, and they didn't identify themselves or anything. It's just one word, and it just said thanks. And
Wow.
it didn't take me long to put that together. It came from overseas, but the controller was just saying thanks for getting our message out,
Wow.
because, like I said, the air traffic controllers are unsung heroes, so to speak, and they're not seen, and people
It
don't know
must feel
much about.
very rewarding.
Yeah. So yeah. So anyway, I dedicate my book to the pilots and controllers, but I didn't want to make my book just about the controllers. I wanted to include the pilots because it is a team effort.
Well, any last words of wisdom you want to share?
But I think it's good for high school, college kids. What do they do if they can't afford to go to college? You know,
Yeah.
you can go to vocational schools, you can go to the service or whatever, and get into a trade. And I think I'm a good example of that. And if they say, hey, if he did it, I can do it. So
That's
I
great.
hope somebody would maybe pick up on that. And that's another reason I like for this story to get out.
So thank you so much for spending your time with us and just sharing your personal story.
I know you'd enjoy it. If you have any inkling in aviation at all, you'd love it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this first episode of The Galley. I'm really excited to see what happens with this show going forth, and this was a great first episode with Cecil. I hope to see you guys next time, and of course, if you have any suggestions moving forward, we're all ears over here, and yeah, we'll see you on the next one.